Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we will be discussing the attempted liberation of the Marquis de Lafayette from an Austrian prison. And we'll be doing so by looking at the life of a founder named Francis Kinloch Huger. Now, before we get started, I do want to say the Marquis de Lafayette is a tremendously important character in the story of the American Revolution, and his life would take up 5 or 6 of these videos, so I will be discussing parts of his life, but I'm not going to get too deep. If there's anything I leave out, believe me, I'm leaving it out to focus on this one story, so this video isn't 7 hours long. Let's get into it. Francis Kinloch Huger was from South Carolina, and he was born just as the American Revolution was beginning. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette, when he came to the United States, came in through South Carolina, and the first house he stayed at was at Francis Kinloch Huger's father's house. So, as just a 4-year-old boy, he met the 19-year-old Lafayette for the first time. And growing up, he heard stories of how great Lafayette was, because the Huger family had his father and several of Francis's uncles all participated in the American Revolution. So he heard stories growing up about what a great guy Lafayette was, and he was pretty great. So, when he is approaching adulthood, Francis Kinloch Huger is sent over to England to study medicine, to become a physician. While he's there, the French Revolution breaks out, and the Marquis de Lafayette, it might surprise some of you, was a moderate during the French Revolution. Now, at a certain point, the Reign of Terror started, and they started chopping off heads, and being a moderate wasn't acceptable. So Lafayette, who at this time was still in his early 30s, ran away. And he tried to escape France, and his plan was to go up to England and take a boat and come to the United States. But while he was going through Austria, he was taken prisoner. And not to get too much into the French Revolution, but because of the French Revolution, they took Lafayette prisoner, for lack of a better term. So, Lafayette was a nobleman, he was a moderate, and he was an American. At this point, at least one, if not more, individual states had granted him citizenship. So, even though the Americans did not have a minister in Vienna, the Austrians kept this in mind. And they treated him nicely. And he would, he was kind of free to walk around, but not to run away. Now, most Americans were like, how is Lafayette in prison? We need to get him out of there. But this was 1792, and George Washington was just still in his first term, about to hit his second term, and Washington was very against getting entangled in foreign issues. It's why he kind of famously, didn't want to get involved in the French Revolution, and I should say he did love Lafayette like a son. In fact, one of the books behind me is a book called Adopted Son, and I'll put an affiliate link down below that I highly recommend this book. It's about the relationship between George Washington and Lafayette. I'm not going to get too into that right now, but suffice to say, Washington loved this man, and he was heartbroken that he was in prison, but Washington put his country above his personal passions, and he said, no, we're not going to help Lafayette. Now, the Congress did pass a resolution to pay Lafayette a pension while he was in prison to take care of himself and his family, because he was a major general in the Continental Army and he deserved this pension. But he was still in prison. Now, a plan was hatched. It was the brainchild of John Barker Church, who was a brother-in-law of Alexander Hamilton's, who was serving as a consul in France at the time, and he recruited one person named Justice Bowman, not Justice like a judge, Justus Bowman was his name, and Bowman was studying medicine, and he happened to be studying alongside today's hero, Francis Kinloch Jr., and that's how Francis Kinloch was recruited to help liberate Marquis de Lafayette from this prison. So, what they did is they bribed a guard to let them send letters to Lafayette. Now, the letters they wrote in lime juice, which was an old-timey way of writing in invisible ink, so to speak. I don't know all the details of how lime juice worked. To be fair, I should have probably looked into that before, but here we are. So they communicated with Lafayette and said, well, how can we get you out? And he wrote back and basically said, they take me out for walks once a day, They take me to the countryside, and I have 3 guards. One of the guards is a big, hefty guy, so to speak, to talk politely, and the other 2 guys are really, really old men. So the assailants, so to speak, Francis Kinloch Huger and Bowman, said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. You know, on this date, which was November 4th, 1794, you are going to get out of your carriage for your walk, and you're going to grab the sword from the big dude, and we're going to run out of the bush and scare the 2 older gentlemen. So, the date arrives, and as Lafayette's getting out of his carriage, he grabs the sword. But to his surprise, the larger fellow overwhelmed him quickly and actually got him on the ground and started choking Lafayette. About this time, Bowman and Huger come out of the bush and they scare the 2 older gentlemen away. And they run over and pull the other guard off Lafayette before he gets too choked. And they give Lafayette a horse and send him on his way. Now, the 2 older gentlemen raised the alarm. And they did capture Bowman and Huger. And Huger would spend about 8 months in prison before being released and going back on the condition that he go back to the United States. Excuse me. Because Austria didn't want to cause too much trouble with the United States. As for Lafayette, he got on this horse and started riding away, but he didn't know the area very well. Again, his plan was, once again, to get to England and take a boat to the United States where he was a citizen and would have lived happily ever after, la-di-da-di-da. Fortunately, he's a little bit lost in Austria, and he's asking people for directions and trying to bribe them to help him. And many of the locals didn't trust this Frenchman, this guy with a French accent, who was trying to bribe them for directions, so they took him prisoner and gave him to the government. Turns out he was Marquis de Lafayette. Unfortunately for Lafayette, he was put back in prison and spent another 3.5 years, this time in much more unhappy conditions. He would, of course, eventually get out and go back to France, blah, 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 and 30 years after this, would come back to the United States and do his famous tour, his farewell tour, which is one of my favorite moments in American history. As for Huger, he came back and he would serve as a physician in South Carolina for several years. He served in the War of 1812 because he had been studying artillery. And he would also serve in the South Carolina House of Representatives and then the State Senate. Eventually, the Marquis de Lafayette comes back for his favorite tour. And on this tour, he comes through South Carolina. And he stays at a house that he had stayed in almost 50 years before. And now, the owner of that house is the son of the former owner, Francis Kinloch Huger. And Lafayette comes and meets Kinloch now only for the 3rd time in their lives. When Kinloch was 4, when Kinloch was in his mid-20s trying to liberate him, and now here where they're both older men, back at the same house where they first met, talking about the revolution, presumably talking about that failed attempt to save him from an Austrian prison. So that's the life of Francis Kinloch Huger, and that's the story of the attempted liberation of the Marquis de Lafayette from France. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like. I really appreciate it. It helps more and more people see my videos. If you are new here and you really like it, I put out videos 5 days a week, live one on Saturdays, so make sure you subscribe for more revolutionary content and more videos about the obscure founding parents of the United States. Also, if you really want to support the site, you can check out a link to my Patreon page down below, or go to my shop where I have some t-shirts with some of my favorite Founding Fathers quotes on them. So thank you, my name is Jason. I look forward to coming back with another video for you tomorrow.